Hello, this is a screencast about web design and specifically about JavaScript and how we can use it. And in the process for this lecture we'll look at some of the common uses of JavaScript. We'll look kind of briefly at something called the DOM, the Document Object Model, which we'll need to know a little bit about in order to be able to effectively use JavaScript. And we'll look at one of the most common uses of the way that a web page interacts with JavaScript, which needs us to know about events and how we can handle those events. You're used to events on any kind of computer. You know, event is when you move your mouse, you press your keys, you resize a window, anything like that. So let's go back to the beginning though, and let's look at what JavaScript is. Well, first of all, it's intended to add interactivity and extra functionality to a web page. It's an object-based client-side scripting language. In other words, it sits on your client, i.e. your web browser. It doesn't sit on the server. It's object-based, so it's an object-oriented type language, which you may know about from other programming languages you do, and if not, it doesn't really matter. We'll explain it as we go. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, but it's usually embedded inside web pages, HTML files, in your case XHTML files, because we're using a particular standard. And what happens, because it's a client-side scripting language, the browser interprets the JavaScript and then displays the result of whatever the JavaScript program does. And in passing officially, it's actually called ECMAScript. And there's a few languages that are around ECMAScript. ActionScript happens to be one, which some of you might be studying elsewhere. So it works on the client and it works inside a browser. And like any client web browser, what that actually does is usually, at least if it's on a web server, make a request of a web server. The web server returns a resource, and that resource is usually a web page, which you already know can contain HTML and usually CSS. And now it can also contain something else, JavaScript. And it's that web page that's returned to the browser. And the browser displays the HTML using the CSS to know how to lay it out, and it runs any JavaScript. So the things we can do with it are what we can do really with any programming tool, but specifically it allows us to respond to events like moving the mouse or pressing a key. We can also write page content dynamically, so you may be seen that before, where the time increments second by second, but we can also do more with it than that. The user can do things and the page content will change, and I'll show you some examples of that. We can use alert messages or do pop-up messages, and we can also, and this is a really important use of it, is we can use it for form validation, so that when we create a form and the user has to type something in, we can make sure that the user has filled out all of the fields that we need them to. We can do also things like image swapping. In other words, when you move your mouse over an image, it changes to another image. They're also called rollovers. There's actually far more we can do with it. There's something called Ajax, which you'll learn about in your second year, where we can actually create a web page programmed with JavaScript that behaves just like an application. And if you're used to using Facebook or Google Docs or things like that, then that's actually written with JavaScript. Let's actually take a quick look at some of JavaScript so that you can get an idea of where we're going. So this is an example page that's linked to from ELP. So the first one is a rollover. There's an image, and when I do a mouse over, I can change the image source of this page. So in other words, I roll over and the image changes to that. And when I on mouse out, it changes back. On mouse over, it changes. On mouse out, it changes again. Okay. I can write some words and dynamically insert them where previously there were none. So here I can type some text, and when I click OK, then that text gets inserted in the page automatically. And I can click and type something else. This, I can't spell, is something else, and click OK, then that gets put in. So it's just happening dynamically. And it can also change the visibility of things, and that can be really quite useful sometimes. You can make something appear and disappear. And I've used an example here in form validation. So the user, when they click there, it tells them they must fill in the surname field, and I'll type something in and move to the forename field, and it says please fill in the forename field. So I can make a kind of help message appear as the user clicks. So how do we do it? Well, we embed our JavaScript in a page, and rather like you can put style sheet content inside a style tag, well, JavaScript, we put the content inside a script tag. And again, whereas in CSS we'd say the type equals text CSS, in JavaScript we say that the type equals text JavaScript. And anywhere between that start point, which is an HTML tag, and this endpoint, the end HTML tag, is JavaScript. Now we usually put these things in as well, and it's explained more in the workshop, but effectively 2 lines like that means it's a comment. So this is a JavaScript comment, and what this means is this is an XHTML instruction, so it gets ignored by JavaScript, hence those, and this tells the HTML validator to ignore any JavaScript so that we don't get XHTML validation errors, not because of our HTML out here, but because of our JavaScript in here. This information is on the workshop, so you'll just be able to cut and paste that, and we'll put our JavaScript code in here. And this script block can actually be anywhere on a web page, anywhere within the HTML code. You can put it in the head section, or you can put it in the body section. Obviously, it depends on what it is you're trying to do. So that argument there to the type attribute defines the fact that it's a script language. And as I say, these 2 elements hide the script from older browsers that don't have JavaScript, and they prevent XHTML validation errors. So let's look at an example. So here I've got a basic web page. Here's the doc type, here's our head section, and here's a body section. And the page loads, and as it loads, it comes across this script, and it just says window.alert, and it says welcome. So it's part of, it will just be executed straight away. Okay. Now, so that's what will happen when the web page is loaded. It sends up an alert with the text welcome in the middle of the page. In short, it's kind of annoying, but it's a good example of how we can do things. It's also a bit of an example about object orientation. This here is called an object, and then dot separates the object from the command we're making that object do. We'll look at that a bit later. So let's have another look at the way in which we could use it. In this example, what I've got is, instead of having a script tag somewhere with a set of JavaScript commands, what I've done is inside the p tag here, I've added an attribute. So you're used to things like style equals, or class equals, or in the case of an image, source equals. But this attribute we're using is an event handler, and it's on click. And there's a few of these event handlers, and we'll look at those shortly. But this basically means that when you click on this paragraph, on the event of clicking, it will do this code. It will alert saying attention, a message. Okay, so at any point on that paragraph that you click, it will throw up an alert message. So let's turn our attention back to some of the terminology that we've already used. First of all, objects. An object is a thing which you can store information about. And as far as a web browser is concerned, any element on a web page is an object. So the HTML tags, or things like paragraphs or headings, are objects with which we can do things. And these objects have certain properties. So as you already know, a paragraph or a div or the body itself can have things like background color or left or width or margin or border. And we can do things with those properties. Now, in addition to properties, Some objects have also methods or functions. In other words, they have behavior. Methods are things that an object can do. So, for example, a document can be written to, and it's got a write method. Like that, document.write. So let's turn our attention now, just this overview of background information, to look at something called the DOM. The DOM, or Document Object Model, you can think of it like a tree that represents all the elements on the web page. So here's an image of that that you can see here, a window. And the window, in other words, the little kind of portal on the browser that you look through, contains a document, and that document might be split into various components, and some of those components, like say you've got a form on the web page, can have components inside it, like text boxes or buttons or checkboxes. So one way of thinking of the DOM is like a hierarchy, where window contains a document, the document contains the elements in the web page, and each element on that web page is also a document. We use JavaScript where we can manipulate the DOM to change content or change attributes. Another way of thinking of the DOM is that it's this hierarchy, or that it's like a tree. You can think of it either way you want. So here, look, an object hierarchy. We might have a window that contains a document, and the document contains both a heading and, say, a div, and the div might inside it contain an image. Or that same representation, we could think of it, if it's helpful for you, of a tree, where the window contains a document, the document contains an HTML tag, start and finish, which is split into two parts, the head and the body, and in the body there's a heading. Our heading there is an H1 here, and on the same level as that, in other words, this div isn't inside that heading, so these two things are what's called siblings. They're of the same kind of level. Inside this one, though, this has a child, an image, so it's like a tree of parent-child relationships, or it's a hierarchy. So let's look at some of the DOM object properties and methods and what they have. So one object is the window object. That's that top level object, and it's got methods like alert, and some of the things that a window contains are also themselves objects. And so a window has got child objects, one of which, say, is history, and the history object has certain methods of itself. So a history object has got a back method. So in other words, if you invoke the back method of history, it'll go back one page, back to the previous element inside the history object. The window has other child objects. So one of them, for instance, is location, and another one is the document itself. And that document object also has properties or methods. So one of its properties is last modified. In other words, the date that the document was last modified. So let's see an example of how we could use and reference a DOM object. So here I've got a small script block, so don't forget this could go anywhere inside your web page, except that since it's displaying something, probably we'll put it inside the body. And we're saying window.alert. So in other words, we're invoking, to use the proper terminology, we're invoking or calling the alert method of the window object, and we're asking it to display the last modified property of the document. And what that will do, because it's an alert, it'll pop up a window telling us the last modified date and time. Now, in addition to working with objects in the document object model, the DOM, we also work a lot with JavaScript with events. Now, all graphic user interface environments, GUIs, are about events. The user moves the mouse, they use the keyboard in some way, they resize a window, and so this is true for all web pages. Whenever you're looking at a web page, in actual fact, behind the scenes, you're always prompting events. And events are things, as I say, like mouse clicks or form submissions or notifications of something happening. And JavaScript, we can program so that it does something in response to an event being fired. So let's look at some event handlers. An event handler specifies the JavaScript code to execute when a particular event is detected by the browser. What we usually do in order to program that is we embed it as an attribute of an element. So if we're concerned with the on-click, we would write inside whichever thing we're trying to program an on-click handler, or in this case an on-mouse over handler, or whatever event it is that we're trying to deal with. And every single object, every single element on a web page, we can insert inside it a handler according to what we're wanting to do. So in this example, look, we've got an A, which is a link, obviously, which would have an href, and we're programming instead an on mouse over, that whenever they put the mouse over this link, it shows up an alert message. In actual fact, this is not such a good example, because with a link, obviously what you want to do is click on it, and what's going to happen here is the moment you put your mouse over the link to click on it, it's going to show up an alert message, which means you'll then have to click on the alert message to say okay, and so it's a bit tricky to click on the link, but you get the idea. The point is we can program any element on the page, and not all elements have these program all events. Not all elements respond to all events, rather. So submit is what you do with a form. So you can only put on submit as an event handler on a form, or unload and on unload is normally attached, for instance, to the body itself, the document body. Whereas we can use load, unload also on an image when it's finished loading. Click, we can put on virtually any element on the page that we can see and therefore click on. Okay. One of the things that we do with JavaScript and the DOM is we use it to manipulate CSS styles. So we can use it to control, dynamically speaking, content presentation using JavaScript and CSS. So every object, every element on a web page has a style object linked to it, and we can use that style object to access various properties of our web page element. So I might want to get to a particular paragraph, and when the user clicks on that paragraph, it'll change color, for instance. And as we've seen before, the DOM is a tree, quite a complex tree of children inside parents which are themselves children of other parents, and it's a kind of complex layering of objects. So frequently, if we want to reach inside the web page and want to pluck something out and alter it, there's that method that I told you about earlier called getElementById that allows us to pull out a particular element. So you might see code like this: window document getElementById, whatever the element is, style property equals something. So what are we looking at? What does that mean? It means that we're going to get the document object, which is a child of window. In fact, because window is the common parent of everything, in this example, you can miss out window, so you could just write document.getElementById. GetElementById is the method of document, and what it does is it will pull out whichever element has got that ID. So if you've got a paragraph somewhere that's been given a particular ID, remember an ID is unique, you can only use it once inside a web page, so that ID uniquely identifies an element. GetElementById will pull out that element, and then we're saying, okay, get that element for me and look at its style object. The style object is built into that element. And please go and look at a certain property and change that property to a certain value. So let's look at what those properties might be. And mostly the properties have the same name as you expect them to have in CSS. So things like border or margin or color. The only difference from that is that if the CSS property contains a hyphen, then we take out the hyphen and make the following character uppercase. So something like border hyphen background hyphen color. How about that? Background hyphen color. We take out the hyphen because after all in a programming language a hyphen usually means minus. Take out the hyphen and we make the following letter uppercase. Instead of background hyphen color, it becomes background color with the C being written as uppercase. Let's look at an example of how this might be put together. So here I've got a div, I've given it an ID of image area. Inside it there's an image with an ID of my image. It's got a source property, a source attribute rather, with the value of offer JPG, and it's got some alt text with the value of offer image. And inside that div is a span. And if you remember, a span is a bit like a div except it's inline. And it's got an ID of image text, except the span look is empty. It doesn't contain anything. So if we were to look at that on the screen, it might look like that. Yeah, that's the offer JPG. It looks like that, nothing else. That is the image that has the ID my image. Okay, and next to it is the span, except there's nothing in it. Okay, so nothing appears on the screen. So let's write a bit of JavaScript. So let's imagine that inside that image that we had before, we've added an extra property. So if you remember, we did end the image tag here, but instead what we've done, I'll put this on a new line for clarity, we've added an extra property or an extra attribute, like ID equals something, source equals something, alt equals something. This is onClick equals something. And the something that the onClick equals is a bit a JavaScript snippet where we say, okay, go into the document, get the element by ID that's called my image, in other words, this image itself, and look at the style object and change a property. Which property? The height property, and set it equal to an arbitrary number of 200 pixels. So what that means is if we click on the image, we will change the height to 200 pixels. So the image looks like that. We click on it and suddenly that image would get larger to look like that. Again, it's not a brilliant example because there's no way of putting the image back to what its size was normally, but you get the idea that we can look at an event on click and we can change some property of that thing. Let's look at one of the other things that we might do. There's a really useful function attached to all HTML tags, a property rather attached to HTML tags, which is called inner, and then in uppercase, HTML. And this is a property of elements that can hold text or HTML, things like div or p or span. And we use this to read content or optionally to change content dynamically. So for example, we might have document get element by ID, that image text, if you remember, which was the empty span in the previous slide, and alter its inner HTML, setting it equal to message. So in other words, if we go back to that example that we had before, now what we're going to do is on click, we erase what we had before, we've changed it so that this time it will get the element by ID. Which element? Image text element, in other words this element here, and it will make its inner HTML of this element equal whatever that message is. So it is blank, but when we click on that special offer with some message or other, then when we click on it, that previously empty span will suddenly contain some text of whatever it was we chose to put into the init HTML property. So we can dynamically update our web page based on user input. Now, sometimes when you're writing HTML, when you're writing JavaScript, you write a lot of JavaScript and you have a more complex set of functionality. Won't happen when you first start, but when you get a bit further on, in just next week conceivably, or the week after, then rather than put your JavaScript in the page, rather like you don't usually put your CSS in the page, often what we then do is write our JavaScript in a separate file and link to it. So if it were style, remember we use href, but with a script we don't use href, we use source equals and specify this external file. That has an advantage because it means we can put our JavaScript there and use it in multiple pages, rather like we can put our style sheet in a separate file and use it on multiple pages. Well, we can use our JavaScript on multiple pages, and that can have that can help us a lot with regard to being able to reuse the code, and it means if we change it, it will still work in lots of different places. So, but we have to remember to do that, we have to specify the name and location of any external file. That script block we can still add anywhere within the HTML code, however. Now, it's important to remember that JavaScript is a programming language, and so as such we've got access to all the normal things that you'd expect to have in a programming language. We can make up variables, we can use loops or iterations like for and while, we can use if statements, we can write functions, it's got functions built into the language, so it's got all the usual features that you'd expect of a programming language. And we've got lots of links to extra information. There are some useful links with information on the W3 Schools site. If you generally do a search for Google JavaScript tutorials, you'll find lots of information. But we've written some in-house for you on the Wheel website that will take you through all that you need to know in order. So that's probably the place to start. If you are interested in looking at other things in addition to that, then these references, I think, will help you.